Welcome to Kawaii's Kitchen, where the meals are hot, but the takes are even hotter. And today's specialty is, the Omega Protocol is good, actually? Endwalker wasn't a perfect expansion as far as content is concerned. No explorable zone, tome-based relic weapons are just passively gained, but it also spikes the cost of potions and keeps the prices high, cause, those tomes have to be used for either the relics or to make potions. Criterion is a great addition, but don't do it if you're looking for an extrinsic reward. Those are quite lacking. But trying to get all 12 endings in variant is super enjoyable if you aren't using a guide. Getting a group of homies together to try and solve the puzzles is a lot of fun. Island Sanctuary eventually becomes basically fully automated, and it's way too tedious to do manually, but at least it nets you some nice glams. Deep Dungeon is always cool, but the unique mechanic of the Demi-Clone is a worse floor clear than the primals from Heaven on High, and the Dread Beasts are too powerful to deal with without a party or instant kill Pomanders. But the weapons are dieable, and the boss mechanics are super cool, but I've still yet to finish all 100 floors for one reason or another. And the raid bosses all having gigantic hitboxes that make getting full melee uptime trivial was also an issue, but at least the fights were bangers. Speaking of bangers, DSR is an unrivaled total package. Granted, it was allowed to marinate for an entire expansion, so it's unlikely we'll ever get something comparable again. It was an ultimate that told a story, instead of just throwing a bunch of memorable mechanics from the relevant fights. The alternate timeline after saving Dat Boy makes sense, though there aren't really a whole lot of recurring mechanics, so each phase can feel pretty disconnected from one another on a gameplay perspective. However, I think Top is just as well designed for a similar reason in that it tells a narrative, though one story beat might be headcanon territory and not intentionally subtle. But Top having a unique combat design and the fight using its story to reincorporate past mechanics is icing on the cake. So, before the Eden Ultimate comes out, allow me to go in depth on exactly what I like and dislike about this fight. But any plat de resistance worth its salt needs a good appetizer. So, for a topic to chew on while we wait for the main course, is Ultimate designed around being able to be pugged? And by extension, should every person be able to do every mechanic on their own for a clear to be legitimate? And if that is the case, are people that never have to adjust considered to be carried? While it's certainly possible this could be the case, and you probably should give weaker players less responsibility, or make sure that healers are split up, but it is guaranteed that someone will be first in priority. But generally, I think no. The amount of responsibility someone has in a fight does not determine the worth of their clear. The nice thing about working together with comms is that the responsibility can be delegated around. This isn't necessarily to carry people through a fight. Someone might need a call up for one mechanic, but somewhere else they can pick up the mantle to take the responsibility off of someone else's plate. Of course, a better player or group could do everything without comms, but high-end mechanics are getting increasingly more complex, especially in Ultimate, and at some point it becomes unreasonable to expect this. Run Dynamis Omega is a prime example of this, so let's put a sandwich pick in that for now. And how does this relate to the first half of the question? I think that Square designs Ultimates around the existence of verbal communications. Obviously, I don't have Yoshi on the line to ask, but the inability to use the Duty Finder for these fights hints that I am correct, which lets them design overly complex mechanics that require people to talk. Of course, there's nothing stopping people from hopping into an instance via PF, but it's not something that the designers consider, probably. And now, with the table finally set, I can serve to you in detail why the Omega Protocol is good actually. The fight begins, and Omega almost immediately takes us to where we would normally fight the level checker. Omega acting as the level check is pretty accurate because he's going to test the party and weed out those unworthy to progress.
What are you?
An idiot sandwich.
This 2-minute phase only has 2 real mechanics in Looper and Pantocrator. And while the execution of Looper isn't very challenging or precise, just grab the tether and run to a safe spot, or stand in a tower. Nothing is roll locked, so everyone has to resolve the same things, but the order changes based on your number. And because this goes out in 4 sets of 2, depending on your partner, you will either be prioritizing clockwise or counterclockwise. Additionally, the 8 towers that get soaked spawn in pairs randomly on the cardinals. More RNG than your body has room for. Though, each cardinal will only ever have 2 towers, so later numbers can use process of elimination to predict where to go. Pando is much of the same, but adjusting here simply means you swap your group by running through the boss and then resolve normally. All you have to do is pay attention to make sure you run out when needed and not drop an AoE in a cringe spot. Finally, after Panto, the party can just go to set spots and ignore who randomly gets marked by the 3 wave cannons, while the tanks stack and invuln the tank busters, which makes it very static and a nice reprieve. This phase front loads so much randomization that everyone needs to keep their brain turned on every pull to react to the dozens of different patterns. Unlike most fights, where you can just bash your head against the wall and memorize the mostly static dance of a mechanic. While this does make the phase exhausting to run over and over, it will either gatekeep those who can't focus or force them to level up and improve, while most likely preserving the difficulty expansions down the road. Though this phase isn't perfect, and while Gear and Dawntrail will likely solve this problem, the DPS check on content is probably just slightly too tight. I normally roll my eyes when this is brought up, but crit variance is a huge issue the shorter the phase. The RNG of Looper can also make it hard for your melees to get all of their positionals every pull, which can swing damage, unless you're Reaper. If this phase was like 1, maybe 2 GCDs longer and was omnidirectional, this would likely be super comfortable, but still not free. But moving on, after proving our might to Omega's first form, he shifts into his 2 humanoid forms to try and mimic and learn from our weaknesses and strengths. This might be my favorite phase given the context of the full fight. Because Beetle is about 2 minutes long, we start off with the 2-minute buff window, but what makes it so special is that for 2 to 3 GCDs, we can hit both targets until they cast Firewall and gain immunity from the furthest 4 players at that time. This is one of the best ways to do a 2-target fight. It's more dynamic as it starts as a 2-target and then becomes 2 single-target fights all during our burst window, so doing the normal bread and butter is a DPS loss. And because the Firewall debuffs are beta by distance, you can pick and choose who goes to what boss. Like, sure, you could split up into light parties, but if you have a Scholar or Ninja, you want to stack 3 DPS on 1 target to get the most value from their targeted debuffs. The only way this could be better is if it was like phase 6 of DSR. There, the 2 dragons are targetable for most of the entire phase, but at certain points one will fly away or push the party away from them and are far outside melee range. And because for these mechanics they are not invulnerable, the range can still pepper them. Pun intended. Now, that does come with the downside of a very strict health check, where the 2 bosses have to be within a few percentages of each other at specific parts or everyone dies. But it's still more engaging than just having 2 different single target fights going on simultaneously. But back to top, after the bosses become untargetable, we get the first real mechanic of phase 2, party synergy.
Damn, synergy!
There is a lot to pay attention to and discern here. First, only 2 of the Omegas will be attacking you, so you have to determine which 2 to look at. Luckily, it's always the 2 opposite each other. And then you have to look at their weapons to determine which one of the 4 patterns they are going to use. All while finding the giant eye to orientate around, as it is going to fire a ray through the arena, splitting it in half. And to know if you need to be closer or further to your tether partner to remove the vuln, so the personal AoEs and ensuing stacks don't kill you. But with being able to line up beforehand and determine your partner with the PlayStation marker and not needing to use the party list, once you get through it a few times, it becomes really chill. After this is resolved and the bosses become targetable again, we get another GCD or 2 of hitting them both after a brief delay before Male tips his fedora to protect the good lady with his very own passage of arms. During this time, we have some tank responsibility with having to take these massive cleaves away from the party, only for one of the Omega clones to shield lob one of them, almost immediately following up with an untelegraphed stack on the closest person, which the person hit by the shield lob can't be a part of. While the tanks are baiting the stuff from the shield clone, 3 random players will get an optimized meteor marker, which do more damage the closer you are to them. But what's cool about this is that with enough shields and mitigation, you can just put all of them in the center with the party stack, and the last raid wide is about 10 seconds after this, so the mitigation will cover all of it. I'm not sure if this is the intended way to deal with the mechanic, but the DPS check to get to phase 3 seems a little too tight for comfort, so my headcanon says this is intentional. But also, I know that Ultimate by itself implies harder mechanics, but narratively I read it as Omega is stronger, able to drop 3 meteors at once, but we have improved even more and are just able to shrug it off. I have another reason why I think it is intentional and not an oversight, but we'll need another sandwich pick. And with that embarrassing display by Omega behind us, he finally shows us his final form. Phase 3 isn't really anything special. The transition will bait you the first time you get to it if you're blind, as there's no way to know about the pulsing ground AoEs before it happens. But once again, the party can line up and look at their debuff to know where they're going with the sniper cannons. Though I might be a little biased with how easy this is. While Brick marks the 2 people with the stacks, I just teleport north if I have either nothing or the stack, which gives me plenty of time to look at the party list to see if I have to adjust or not instead of using said marks. Once fully formed, Omega's first mechanic this phase is Hello World, and you are giving a lot of debuffs to try and parse. But once you piece together what you do, you can really just follow the same cycle every pull, because the debuffs themselves don't really matter. And the small changes between each pull is not any different than regular fights, where you just have to orientate your camera and move the base around a relative position. So this is really just an autopilot mechanic. Just make sure you don't pass Nises accidentally and it's free low. It is a strong contender for being omnidirectional because of how much random movement in boss facing there is. The last part of Phase 3 is kind of annoying, at least for me on controller, though it's a cool upgrade to the Savage mechanic. Omega projects a large screen on his left or right and blasts everyone on that side with a large AoE. But he also puts this same monitor on 3 random players. So the goal is to have each monitor hit 2 and only 2 people. My problem is with how precise this is, and because it's so precise, a small turn can spell doom for the party, and because controller has full 360 degree movement and my character facing is angled, it's really deceptive to me. So being a couple degrees off was a little too common. I had to resort to pre-facing my camera and tapping the W or S key to make sure the facing was good. And before you kill Omega here, if you have the damage to spare, refresh any debuffs on him as they carry over between phases, which is a really cool touch. And after we deal with monitors and demolish Omega with what should have been for good, he, refusing to accept defeat, forcibly reboots, disregarding the warning about his structural integrity, wanting to fight on and complete his experiment. It's here that I should bring up that I wish Square would spend a little bit of the money they are raking in to give us voice lines for all of the raids. It's annoying having to deal with dodging everything while reading text boxes. Ugh! But the first tier of the Arcadian seems to be a step in the right direction, so let's hope it continues on this path. The wave cannon from Phase 1 comes back, but with a twist. This time after the first, a second untelegraphed beam comes out from where the first was baited, so you gotta get out of the way and can't have someone just sit where the stacks will meet up. But once the aptly named blue screen finishes casting, the broken down robot explodes, taking the party with him. Unless his health is below 20%, and this fight was pretty chill once you get into the rhythm. Oh, it seems Omega survived crashing as well. And what's revealed as the dust settles is the human forms from Phase 2, though they are now Super Saiyan and looking confused as to why you haven't hit like and subscribe yet. And while it's minor, I really like that we get unique models here. Normally in Ultimate, it's only the last phase with new models after a cool transition. And it's usually a lengthy animation where there's no damage going out. Or in the case of T, a really cool transformation, which is there to reset your cooldowns and try and forcibly realign buffs for a normal opener. However, DSR flipped the script and Thornton pulse raid-wides and bleeds to make sure the party wasn't caught sleeping. So, who knows, maybe blue screen was the transition into the final phase. Pretty unlikely with how far into the fight we are at this point, but in another timeline we might have gotten an 8 to 10 minute long phase. But regardless, true Demon Souls, Omega Protocol, starts here, as evident by Escape starting to play as the background music finally. Unsure of what this new power-up is, Omega starts running a new experiment. The first trio of the fight run Dynamis Delta, but since Omega doesn't know what Dynamis is yet, the cast name is scrambled. I have a very small gripe with the cast names in these last 2 phases, but put a pin in that until the end of the fight. This trio starts off by pairing everyone up with a friend. There will be 2 Christmas tethers and 2 blue tethers that function like they did in Hello World. The green tethers will snap if they get too close, and the blue tethers will do the opposite, with each snap giving the party 2 stacks of Thrice Come Ruin. But with a soft spread, it's quite simple to see what kind of tether you have and who you're attached to. And there are plenty of ways to set up and resolve the first part. Now, I'm a little biased for how my group deals with the Christmas tethers by spreading them out on either side of the giant eye in the background. The blues can do all sorts of things. They can always go relative east or west, or they can just always go to the beetle or final omega. But when you pick a strategy, it'll be Daijobu. Now, with the setup out of the way, a fist spawns behind each player, and the 2 east and the 2 west Christmas tethers need to stack with one another to bait a blue and yellow fist on top of each other so they don't explode. So one tethered pair may need to swap positions, and the same is true for the other sets of tethers. And then they go to the 4 intercardinal hands on the edge of the arena to spin them outside. And at the same time, the long blue tethers wait until they snap to go meet up with the short pair of tethers to bait the colored hands and then run to the center to deal with the pile pitch thing that the tanks dealt with in Phase 2. The 2 remaining tethered players run to go spin the north and south hands and then run back into the center. We need the 4 blues in the center to take the stack that comes from the first shield lob, but it's a little more complicated than before. Final Omega will get a monitor, and in a rare instance of something being not completely random, one of the initial blue tethered players will also get a monitor with the goal of hitting the 4 players who are still tethered. Thankfully, because half the party is roughly in the center of the arena, aiming this monitor is far less strict. But in very unlucky situations, if you're starting north and final is cleaving north, you have almost no extra steps to spare to hit the correct people. Finally, no, we're still not done. Beetle Omega will do an iconic starboard or larboard cleave, but thank the Lord there's a visual tell, so the cast name is just for flavor. And then the main gimmick of this phase rears its ugly head like an idiot sandwich.
What are you?
An idiot sandwich.
Dynamis jumps will be applied to 2 blue tethered party members, and one of these debuffs will blow up on the debuffed player and then jump to the furthest player twice, and the other is the same, but it's the closest player. And getting hit by one of these gives you a stacking buff that you need to get everyone in the party up to 3 stacks by the end of the phase. Think of it like awakening the primals from Uwu, but in reverse. And make sure to pay attention to the vulnerability debuffs before snapping the green tethers during and after starboard or larboard, or people will get doomed. This is probably the hardest part of the phase to get down consistently, because the responsibility between the randomly assigned roles can be so radically different between pulls, and you don't always get to practice what you're lacking. And it can only be lightly mitigated by having one person always be the long blue tether if they get that, or go to the non-adjusting side closest to Beetle if they get the other tether, limiting their possible patterns down to just 3. But that also requires everyone else to pay attention or delay half a second before moving to avoid people going to the same spot. Not quite able to comprehend this newfound power yet, as it is beyond the values he should be able to achieve, we get our next experiment, Run Dynamis Sigma. We have Party
Synergy
back, which functions exactly like it did in Phase 2. But now with Final Omega in the mix, how we have to resolve this part changes. What we have to deal with first is Omega places prey markers on 6 mostly random players. The only caveat being that each pair will have at least 1 marker between them. These prey markers indicate who will be getting hit with a conal blast from the main body, and these 2 floating hands shoot lines at the furthest player. Once you figure out a lineup, either circle, X, triangle, square, or the inferior BPOG, not dying to this is really easy. But remember what marker you move out to, because that equates to which of the 5 or 6 towers you have to get knocked back into. But this is also easy enough after getting there a few times. It's also a nice callback to Looper, since the towers work the same way. Though, this part is just filler to give you time to see the rest of the debuffs, because the near and far jump debuffs go out when the tethers appear. The second half of Sigma deals with the Hello World debuffs, and avoiding getting tagged by the rotating beam in the center of the arena, while avoiding Omega F's AoE. And this is where group communication starts to become recommended. Because the initial stacks and current jumps are all on random people, if someone with no stacks goes to bait the hand, they won't have enough opportunity after this to reach the required stacks. So you need people with 1 stack to not be involved with the jumps. But also, if you have 1 stack and currently have a jump, you can't bait the hand. Communication is the main skill check of Phase 5. You could have 1 person mark 3 people to go towards female, 2 for the hands and 1 for the far bait. But you still need someone from the south group to call who's going for the other far bait. This could also be done with some priority shenanigans based on Delta with only a little bit of pain. And maybe it's a little unreasonable for PF, but I'm going to explain it anyway. Okay, so hear me out. The 2 people who had the jump debuff during Delta default to grabbing the hands now, because they are guaranteed to have 1 stack, unless they get a jump for a second time. And they can always just self-mark themselves at some point before Sigma starts with a 1 and 2. And then the spare parts from Delta default to being the near or far jump baits unless they get the debuffs. In the remaining 4 players, the people who were the green tethers in Delta prio their spots based on their final positions in Delta, and use that priority to adjust if need be. It will likely still need some communication, but at least there will be a flowchart to follow. And then comes Run Dynamis Omega, which is both the hardest and easiest trio in the fight, which means it's time to refer back to that first sandwich pick I mentioned at the start. But high-end mechanics are getting increasingly more complex. There is a lot going on here, which is what makes it so hard. A male and female Omega pair spawns at each of the Cardinal 2 at a time to do one of their 4 patterns from Phase 2. While Final Omega cuts off much of the safe area with giant cone blasts. Oh, and Omega is still targetable for all of this, and it's a burst window. But because Ultimate is designed around being a pre-made group, we can delegate responsibility. 1 player could mark 2 people to go take the Omega monitors. Another could mark 2 people for baiting the near or far jumps, while a third calls out where to dodge for the AoEs so the DPS can solely focus on their 2-minute. This way, instead of having all 8 people try to do their burst, look to see if they are baiting monitors or jumps, and looking at the Omegas. Each person is only focused on 2 things, which makes a very complex series of events significantly more manageable for everyone. Now yes, a better player could do all of it. Look at the entire party list to determine if they are monitor, or where to stand if they are baiting a jump. Look at the Omegas to dodge properly, and keep up their damage, and a better group could do all that without comms. But at some point, all of that becomes an unreasonable expectation. Maybe 1 or 2 people in a group could do it consistently, but honestly, does anyone think they could pull together a full group who could do it all without any words? So with a bit of teamwork, we get set up to have the spare parts take the monitors and make sure the first in line jumps are baited properly. And then right after, we have to do it again. But thankfully here, 2 people should be at max stacks, so they know they have to grab the mustard bomb tethers from Beetle. The people with the jumps only have 1 place to go, and the other 4 have plenty of time to just go find a place if no one wants to call spots. So what starts off as the hardest trio ends as the easiest. And when that's done, all that's left is a tank buster and enrage. And if Omega is below 20% when Blind Faith finishes, you'll survive the damage and get knocked into the wall. So take a deep breath and don't let your nerves get the better of you, because any mistake from here on will make the final phase impossible. This cutscene isn't nearly as Sentai as T, but it has so much more heart. Alpha shows up to say goodbye to his friends one final time before fusing with Omega. Finally giving him an understanding of Dynamis, and he wants to run one final test. Being a final phase, mechanically it's not very challenging at all, and for the first time in this entire fight, each person only ever has one job for every mechanic, so it's easy to learn. The small timing changes based on if it's a dodge in or dodge out pattern, and rotating the camera to find where the exaflares start is something everyone who's made it this far is able to quickly turn into a non-issue. But the first thing we have to deal with is just some exa lines leading into a pair of tank busters and party stack. The following exaflares are nothing special. Just follow behind them with step dodges to bait the ground AoEs just like you have already done in Pantocrator, which ends with the same baited beams we've seen in Phase 1. Just the tanks are also targeted, and these beams are massive by comparison. And then we get a repeat of all of this, except the stack and spreads after the exas flip. After this loop, we get the coolest bit yet. While Omega thinks Dynamis is his ally, he merely adopted the Dynamis. We were born in it, molded by it.
Oh, you think darkness is your ally? You merely adopted the dark. I was born in it, molded by it.
So, we show him what it can really do with the power of anime and friendship on our side. First, Omega thinks he's going to get us with falling meteors, but the caster in range of the group use their limit breaks to deal with them. But now it's time to pull off that other sandwich pick from Phase 2. I read it as Omega is stronger, able to drop 3 meteors at once, but we have improved even more and are just able to shrug it off. I have another reason why I think it is intentional and not an oversight. Once again, 3 random players get Cosmo Meteors to fall on them with a party stack for the remaining 5. But unlike before, in this final form where he has accepted his shadow,
I am a shadow, the true self.
These meteors are too strong to be stacked. And after the meteors are handled, Omega tries to get the party by throwing a pair of very powerful raid-wise that would prove fatal if not for the tanks limit breaking them. The healers deal with the attached doom to each of these raid-wides with their own limit break, and then finally enrage. I do kind of miss the enrages of old that gradually kill off the players, but it's really hard to keep finding new ways to do that. And now for that gripe I brought up. Every run Dynamis cast has the same scrambling on it. Such a missed opportunity for the first one to be all of Dynamis scrambled, and then with each cast, more and more is revealed until the enrage, which is decoded perfectly, demonstrating a growing understanding of the power. And finally defeated, Alpha and Omega go off to explore the world just like in the side quest. I know this ultimate is exhausting to prog because of all the adjusting throughout the fight, so I totally understand why people don't like this encounter. But I think some of the reason is the get good mentality, where people seem to expect the whole party to be self-reliant start to finish. And hopefully, I've expressed my point well enough to explain why I think this fight is just hard and not poorly designed, at least from a static standpoint. And I also like the mechanical storytelling of this fight. And who knows, maybe I even changed someone's mind as to why this is a good fight. And personally, I'm really excited to see what Square is cooking up for Eden.